Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. The news this week is more about what's happening in America and other parts of the world than it is about what's happening here in Israel. After 1.5 years that included 3 elections, we finally have a government, and there'll be a government policy agreed upon by all members of the coalition. And that's nice. One of the most interesting and critical issues that will be decided is whether Israel will annex those areas of the Holy Land that are to be included within the borders of Israel according to the Trump plan. The map makers are meeting, but no one knows at the moment what they're deciding, so there's nothing to comment upon. The settlement leaders themselves are divided upon whether to accept partial annexation at the moment. There are warnings from the Army and the Israeli security agencies about possible responses to annexation by the Arab countries, particularly Jordan, the Palestinian Street, and even the countries in the European Union. All the so-called experts are making predictions based on what appears to be very little knowledge. Rather than discuss annexation, what I will discuss this week is my impressions about what's happening on the streets of the United States. I'm old enough to recall the civil rights movements of the 60s and the disturbances that went along with them, and remember the anti-war demonstrations during the Vietnam War and the disturbances that went along with them. They were very difficult times, and I suppose we can say that they changed the course of history. But the violence itself, as bad as it was relatively short-lived, did not last long, and the country returned to a new normal. The normal changed because of the demonstrations. There was a new normal and things got calm again. Maybe the same thing will be true today. I'll discuss this a little bit in my program this week. Again, thanks for listening. I'll be right back.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. It is sad and it is tragic to see what's happening today in the United States. I am old enough to remember chaotic periods. I remember the civil rights struggle during the 60s. I remember the turmoil during the Vietnam War, and a lot of things that went on in America, and the country recovered. It is going through a crisis now, and looking at it both as an American and as an Israeli, I am really saddened because there is something else that is happening now that did not happen in all the other chaotic periods. And that is, there is a visceral hate, a real hate by a large percentage of the country against the President of the United States today. I do not recall this kind of hate directed during a president in my lifetime. I remember when I came on Aliyah 50 years ago, we compared what was happening in Israel to the United States. We were always frustrated with the bureaucracy or the problems of life here, and we always compared it to America. As a matter of fact, I can probably say in all sincerity that once we moved away from America and came to Israel, we began to create in our own minds an idealized America. I remember America as a kid. I remember traveling in the South on the separate bathrooms for Negroes, and there's all kind of things in society that weren't good, but there was always the feeling that the society was improving, that it would get better. There is always cracks in the ideal. No society is perfect, but the violence and the racism and the cynicism in the United States, particularly because of this visceral hate of the president, I think that's one of the really bad things that I never saw before. We have those who came on Aliyah, of course, have an emotional attachment. Many of us have a lot of relatives left in America. I don't have that many myself, but Israel itself has developed a dependence upon the United States, which is our greatest ally. And of course, we want our ally to be healthy. It is America that provides us with massive military aid, without which we'd be in great trouble. But we defend ourselves. That's one of the conditions of the aid. We do not ask for American troops. America provides us support in the international community. We need America, we rely on America, and we value America. And now something is happening to that ideal. You had the coronavirus to begin with, and the scenes that are playing out on the streets of America's big cities, all the big cities, it's not the stuff of which Israeli dreamed of America. One of the main topics here among particularly former Americans here in Israel is what's going on in America. Will it survive? Now, obviously, America will survive. It's a strong country with an abundance of resources, both human and material. It is made up fundamentally good people who want to do good in their lives and in the world. Americans have died in the last century to make the world a better place. It's a powerful country, and it has survived some terrible things. I remember the civil rights struggles were really difficult. And I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He happened to have been assassinated by an Arab, a Jordanian. I remember the Democratic Convention in 1968 that ended in chaos. There were all kind of bloody riots, but America survived. But the difficulties the United States is facing right now is leading a lot of people to say that Israel, publicly, that Israelis need to reevaluate their personal relation with the United States. We don't have to reevaluate our relationship politically and diplomatically. The U.S. is Israel's greatest friend, and it's an ally which Israel will always owe a tremendous debt of gratitude. But a lot of people here, even Americans, former Americans, are looking at the United States differently and reevaluating their own feelings. You can look at America with appreciation. You can marvel at the achievements, at the progress that the United States has brought to the world. But something is happening there that has never happened before. And I think a lot of it, as I said before, is due to the fact that on top of all the problems, there is a public and visceral and political hatred of the president. And that's sort of I guess you could call it a new ball game. It hasn't been like this before. It's a new element in the mixture. There's a newspaper here in Israel that's given out free every day. It has a big edition on Friday, also given out free. It's called Makor Rishon. It's been around for about 10 years. And an article was written last Friday by someone named Ari Shavit. And he said the following: the United States today is at a crossroads. The riots are a warning alarm and a wake-up call. But Israel also needs to wake up. For too many years, Israelis have admired and worshipped America. The right, the political right here in Israel, adopted the religion of the free market, and the left adopted the culture of protest and hypocrisy. Therefore, as the American model seems to be collapsing before our eyes, we need to essentially wise up. We need to separate ourselves from the harmful tendency to belittle ourselves before America and our imitation of America. It's time we return to our core values as Israelis. The isolation, the separation, the life changes forced on everyone as a result of the coronavirus has compelled many people here in Israel to reevaluate a lot of things, to look inward and reevaluate priorities. Maybe what was considered so important before, and that is before the pandemic, things Israelis love to do: travel, entertain, shopping, consumerism. Maybe that's all not that is not all that important after all. Essentially the crisis in the United States is causing many people to evaluate our relationship with the United States. You see this in all kind of articles in the newspapers. You hear it on the radio and you see it on television. The the protests and the riots and the police action and the way the U.S. government, both on the federal and local level, is dealing with these problems has compelled many here in Israel to take a more realistic look at the United States and realize that as much as there is to complain about in Israel, and one of the biggest indoor sports in Israel is complaining. When I first came on Aliyah, I remarked the difference between secular Israelis and religious Israelis. What secular Israelis got together on Friday night and complained about the country, but religious Israelis were busy celebrating and observing the Sabbath, so they had to wait until Saturday night to get together to complain about the country. But in the 50 years I've lived here, the country has changed tremendously. It's unrecognizable compared to the way it was. And always people were comparing us, what's happening here in Israel, to the United States. But now they're taking a new look at the United States. Hopefully this chaos will pass. But it's hard to tell because a lot of things are different in the States than they were before. There was a time when people accepted the president. There are still people today who think that Trump is an illegitimate president. And there are also the difference. I think also is I haven't really thought this through completely, but years ago there was a draft in the United States. Young people did national service. They were drafted into the army. Today, all those young people are now on this, or not all, but certainly a lot of them are now on the streets with time on their hands. And that leads, idle hands lead to not good things. So the United States is going through a crisis, which I hope it will recover from, and I believe it will. But even our relationship with the United States has to be reevaluated because the United States is definitely going to recover, but it will not be as it was before, I think. That's, of course, that's my opinion. But we have to reevaluate our relationship with the United States. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Back with Jay Shapiro. I have been watching the news reports from the United States with increasing anxiety and consternation to see the major American cities on fire. And I started writing out my notes that I wanted to say about it. And I came across an article by Alan Dershowitz, and he says what I want to say. So with the permission of the listeners, I want to quote what Dershowitz says. And I quote as follows: as usual, anti-Israel extremists, especially some on the hard left, are trying to exploit the tragic and inexcusable death of George Floyd to level their typical baseless charges against Israel. Signs and chants at several protests have either tried to blame Israel for training the policemen who are responsible for Floyd's death, which is not true, or to compare police brutality in America with legitimate efforts by the Israeli military and police to prevent acts of terrorism against civilians in Israel. A cartoon that's being circulated on social media shows an American policeman with his knee on the neck of an African American man and an Israeli soldier with his knee on the neck of a Palestinian man. The policeman and the soldier are embracing, and the caption above it reads, "Black Lives Matter." That although there is no evidence that the organization has anything to do with this bigoted cartoon, a painting of George Floyd wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh is also being circulated, and BDS proponents at the University of California are accusing Israel of training racist American policemen. Anti-Israeli graffiti, including Free Palestine, has been sprayed on synagogue walls in Los Angeles during anti-racist demonstrations. This blame it on Israel or blame it on the Jews bigotry is common throughout the world at demonstrations, even for legitimate causes that are unrelated to the Mideast. Anti-Israel extremists from the hard left try to promote the intersectionality propaganda that all the evils of the world are produced by privileged white democracies such as the U.S. and Israel. Islamic extremists, who are hard to classify as left or right, use any excuse to demonize Israel. Anti-Semitic extremists from the hard right have always tried to blame the Jews for all the world's evils. An old Polish expression summarized it well. If there's trouble in the world, the Jews must be behind it. Today, that's been expanded by the hard left and Islamic extremists to include the nation-state of the Jewish people among those who cause the world's problems, ranging from capitalism to destruction of the environment to police violence. This organization, Black Lives Matter, which does much good, is not immune from the bigotry. Its own platform blames Israel for police violence against African Americans and compares such violence to what it falsely calls the genocide of the Palestinian people. Many good people who support the organization are unaware of its gratuitous demonization of Israel and who would oppose such distractions from its core mission. A Palestinian activist by the name of George Zidane has urged his followers to leave Palestine out of the current protest, lest it take attention away from this watershed moment in Black American history. Not everything is about the Palestinians, despite efforts by intersectionalists to make it so. And not everything is about Israel and Jews, despite the obsessive focus of the hard left and the hard right on these tiny elements of the issues facing the world. Historically, the Jews have always been caught between the black of fascism and the red of communism. This was true in the 1920s and the 1930s in Europe, and there's a danger that could now manifest itself during this time of extremism when bigots of both sides are prepared to scapegoat the Jews and their nation state, Israel. Those of us who are both Jewish and liberal, and keep in mind, by the way, that I'm quoting Dershowitz, who is a known liberal, he goes on to say, those of us who are both Jewish and liberal, who support Israel and oppose unjustified police violence, must be willing to participate and encourage legitimate protests, but we must stand up and be heard against those who would exploit tragedies to foment violence against Jews and Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people. We must not be afraid of being criticized for condemning bigotry on all sides. As the great sage Hillel put it 2,000 years ago, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am not for others, who am I? And he ended his statement with a call to action, and if not now, when? But now is also the time to speak out against those who would hijack this tragic history to manifest the oldest continuing prejudice known to mankind, anti-Semitism. In other words, unquote, in other words, the anti-Semites are latching on to what's happening, the real and imagined crimes against the Black community, and there are real crimes. They're tying this to intersectionality, which means that all people who are being persecuted have something in common with each other. That's simply not true. Almost immediately after the disturbing video of the killing in Minnesota was released, anti-Israel BDS groups began posting on social media about how Minneapolis police are trained by the Israeli army. Similarly, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights posted about how numerous U.S. police departments are trained in Israel. In a social media post, they claimed that the Israeli military trains U.S. police in racist and repressive policing tactics, which should systematically target blacks and brown bodies. The Democratic Socialists of America BDS group claimed that the Minneapolis police brutality is straight out of the Israeli army playbook. The tweets and posts came from both BDS organization accounts and individual activists, particularly from far-left groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, who have targeted Israeli counterterrorism training programs conducted in Israel for various police departments, particularly from the United States. Students at the University of California schools have launched a petition calling for the University of California system to divest from Israel and implying Israel is responsible for the death of George Floyd. The petition explicitly stated, and I quote, the knee-to-neck tactic chokehold that used to murder George Floyd has been used and perfected to torture Palestinians by Israeli occupation forces through 72 years of ethnic cleansing and dispossession, unquote. So now you have this intersectionality, a word that was invented some time ago. Ethnic cleansing is defined as the systematic forced removal of ethnic or religious groups from a given territory by a more powerful group with the intent of making it religiously or ethnically homogeneous. This means the means used to achieve this may include deportation, forced population transfer, and physical or mental intimidation. That is the definition of intersectionality, and that's what is now being used to essentially say that intersectionality holds that various forms of oppression are tied together somehow. And in this worldview, a transcendent white male heterosexual power structure keeps down marginalized groups. Uniting oppressed groups is the best thing to do to fight intersectionality. And essentially, Jews and the state of Israel are being accused of intersectionality. So here you have a murder that took place in Minnesota, and all these anti-Semites have latched onto it. And in particular, in New York, according to news reports, gangs broke up, destroyed a lot of stores, a lot of businesses, but in particular, Jewish stores in Manhattan, particularly on 47th Street in the Diamond District. So, somehow everything that happens can be blamed on the Jews, and that's what's happening now. The truth of the matter is, it's kind of frightening. I hate to see this happen in American society. America is the place where I was born and raised, and I don't like to see it go down the drain, because if America's in trouble, the whole world's in trouble. I'll be back after the break.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
We live in the age of information, but not inspiration. If you're like me, you're looking to be inspired to reach higher, to connect more, and to grow. Well, if you want to get warm, you need to stand close to the fire. And if you want to catch fire, you need to stand close enough to get hit by the sparks. Join me, Penina Taylor, as we walk with people who have embarked on a spiritual journey towards Torah. We'll uncover what started them on their journey and what truths they discovered along the way. So prepare to be inspired as we take a leap of faith every Sunday at 5 p.m. on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. As a general rule, I have a policy not to But I saw something on the news that really disturbed me. The leaders of the Democratic Party in the Congress were bowing in prayer, more or less as a demonstration. They're they're trying to make it look like it's in favor of memory of the black man who was murdered in Minnesota, but it was more or less a political act against President Trump and against the Republican Party, which I think is really in bad taste and very heavy-handed, and an attempt to appeal to the left wing of the Democratic Party, the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is becoming less and less sympathetic toward Israel. Incidentally, the primary candidate for president on the Democratic ticket, Joe Biden, has already come out and said that he's opposed to the Israeli annexation of the Jordan Valley, although that is given to Israel according to the Trump plan. One of the reasons why it puts a lot of pressure on the here in Israel to do something about annexation before the election in November, because if the Democrats get in, we're going to have a lot of opposition to anything we do here in Israel, particularly regarding annexation. Now, having said that, I want to say a couple more things. Again, I'm sort of violating my own rule not to talk about American politics, but I feel it incumbent upon myself at this stage to say something. The appearance now is that the United States is divided on every issue. I don't know how true that is, but it is so divided, whether it comes to police or how to handle race relations, that it could well be that the image that Trump has as being a law and order person could work in his favor. Some Democrats tried to ignore the protests or discredit them while claiming that violence was fueled by white supremacists. There's little evidence that the old timers in the Democratic Party feel comfortable with these youthful protests. They're worried that it could sweep them away also. In other words, they might lose. There are still old timers who more or less control the Democratic Party, but there is a revolutionary youth in that party, which is pretty much to the left, pretty much anti-Israel, just looking at it from our viewpoint. In the meantime, the old guard is holding on, but they could be swept away in what's happening now. They're worried that they could be swept away, and these are the protests that underpin the Squad, which is a group of those young members of the House of Representatives who are very much anti-Israel also. Or essentially, it's not just the Squad, but it's the more radical left portion of the Democratic Party. In the past, when radicals dominated the Republican or Democrats, it split the party and led them to defeat. Trump apparently, as I can see from here, and again, I'm only an amateur analyst, but it seems to me that Trump's been good at trying to zero in on those weaknesses in the opposite party and split the opponents apart. He's good at branding and labeling. This is the thing that makes his presidency seem like a kind of game show. And of course, he had experience in game shows. But for his supporters, these easy explanations tend to serve well. His supporters like simple mottos and simple slogans. Trump says Antifa and radical leftists are behind the protests, and that's enough for his supporters. You don't hear from him. I'm talking about the people who don't live in the big cities, who live out in the rural areas, the non-urban areas of the big states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and so forth. So he's very good at playing to them. Brand the people making the riots as extremists, then anyone who supports the protest will be tainted as being an extremist. Once you can show someone is lying or there is something false happening, the public will believe you. If you can show that the protesters are looters, then you can tar their moderate supporters with the same logic. So Trump will be able to successfully show now that the COVID-19 virus restrictions were largely a left-wing agenda because he can point to the protests as an example of how the liberal governors and mayors allowed protest but not prayer. That's interesting. In other words, the the states pretty much are controlled by the Democrats, and the cities certainly are. And they said, listen, you have to stay home. People are home for 2 months, but now you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people rioting or protesting and not keeping any kind of social distance, which the mayors and governors were pushing for the last 3 months. In other words, if you protest, you don't have to watch how far away you're standing from the next protester. So the truth of the matter is that gives the governors and the mayors a bad name. So what seems like a crisis, it could be an opportunity for the president. Trump apparently thrives on these crises. He wants to use them as wedge issues to force the point. His supporters increasingly talk about civil war and civil strife, and the fact is that mass protests, which leave many Americans bewildered and many businesses destroyed and many people out of work, can be seen as forcing that issue. Let the protesters graffiti war memorials, which they've done. For example, the protesters put graffiti on a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is the guy who wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the Negro slaves, and now his statues are being smeared with graffiti by the protesters. So the Trump's logic may be that in the end, there's something called the silent majority. That was defined by President Nixon. And the silent majority will rise up. That's what I think Trump is hoping. Nixon used that silent majority back in 1968 to become elected president. In 1968, and I remember it, was one of the most revolutionary years in U.S. history. There were riots I remember 1968, both Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. That led to riots. There were riots all over the place. I remember that. It was when I myself was preparing for Aliyah, and I was sort of looking at things not only as a Native American who had always been interested in politics, but looking at sort of objectively as somebody who was about to leave the States, who was evaluating American society at that moment. So I gave it a lot of thought back in those days. So back in 1968, massive protests and civil rights movements all came together. In the end, 1968 was not a year of revolution. It was a year, essentially, I guess you could say, of reaction. It's not the same as revolution. And Nixon was right. The silent majority watched what was going on, and they voted Nixon into office. Now, you could well have the same thing happening now. There is a silent majority watching what's going on in the big cities. And incidentally, one of the things I note in the newsreels that most of the protesters who are really they're really terrible. The protests, for example, they forced policemen to kneel. They behaved terribly to public officials, and a crazy thing in Minneapolis is talking about doing away with the police. I mean, really crazy ideas. And the silent majority is watching this. And the silent majority is going to say, we don't want this. We don't want the United States to fall apart. So it could well be that this silent majority. Again, it's a title invented by Nixon, but indeed it turned out to be such a thing. It could well be that people you don't see in the newsreels now who are not marching in the streets and they're not breaking windows in Midtown Manhattan. It could well be that those people will rise up in a reaction against what's happening. And again, it's not revolution, it's reaction. And the reaction will come from the silent majority. And this should be a very interesting election year in the United States. We're almost down to an election already. We're now in June, and we're talking election just a few months down the road when you have the virus and the social unrest all happening at the same time. Again, I think I had occasion to say in the past that there's a Chinese blessing that I would say to someone, I hope you live in quiet times. Unfortunately, we aren't fortunate enough to be living in quiet times. We're living in interesting times. Anyhow, I hope things will calm down by next week. So until then, take care of yourself. Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.